Harmony and chords play two or more notes at once, and the musical interval between the notes determines their tonality and mood. Major chords are generally considered to sound happy or optimistic, as in I Feel Pretty from the musical West Side Story.
I feel pretty, oh so pretty. I feel pretty and witty and bright, and I pity any girl who isn't me tonight. I feel charming.
Minor keys are often sad and serious, such as the song Jolene by Dolly Parton.
Jolene, 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 I'm begging of you, please don't take my man.
The most common harmony is in thirds, where each melody note is accompanied by a harmony note a third higher, as in this harmonized C major scale. Each of these note pairs forms a simple chord that's related to the key of C. Another common arrangement puts the harmony a sixth below, using the same note that would have been a third above. For example, E is a third above C and also a sixth below. This puts the melody note on top rather than the harmony, keeping the melody more prominent. Another common harmony is an interval of a tenth, which is similar to a third but an octave higher. As you can hear, this creates yet a different flavor. Here's another example of tenths you may recognize. Tenths are especially useful in the lower registers to avoid two low notes being close together, which creates a muddy sound. Contrast that with the same low bass scale harmonized only a third above, which sounds congested. Just as musical notes can be referred to by either their letter name or numeric position within the scale, the same applies to chords. As with scale notes, there are 7 chords for each musical key, using Roman numerals to distinguish them from note numbers. Simple chords are called triads because they contain 3 notes, the first, third, and fifth notes of the scale. These chord examples repeat the root note of each chord an octave lower in the bass staff, because that's a common way to write such a part for the piano. Note the way the piano chords are played with a slight arpeggiation, or roll, to better hear the individual notes. Rather than play all 4 notes of each chord at exactly the same time, the notes are staggered, so each higher note plays slightly after the note before. The wavy line to the left of a chord shown here is common in piano and harp music to indicate this style of playing. You can see that some of the chords are inherently major, while others are minor, using lowercase Roman numerals to indicate minor. We'll get to advanced chords soon, but for now notice the B diminished chord, second from the right. As was explained, basic triad chords are created from the first, third, and fifth notes of a scale. The interval between the root and the third defines whether a chord is major or minor, but the fifth note in a B minor scale is an F sharp, which doesn't exist in the key of C. So this chord is diminished because the fifth F natural is a half step lower than F sharp. We'll examine diminished chords in more detail later. In the same way different chords are based on each note of a scale, additional scales are created by starting on different notes as you saw earlier. All 7 scales here are in the key of C, without sharps or flats, but each has a different quality and mood. These scales are also called modes, and each has a different name. That last scale leaves you hanging, doesn't it? I'll cover tension and resolution later. Note the Lydian scale, whose 4th note is a half step higher than a normal major scale. I call this a sharp 4 in lieu of a more formal name. The first 4 notes of this scale are all a whole step apart, creating a flavor similar to the whole tone scale played earlier. The sharp 4 will also be discussed in more detail later. A group of chords played in succession is called a chord progression, and many simple chord progressions are used in popular music. Perhaps the most common is the blues progression, also called a straight progression. You've probably heard the term 3-chord rock songs, referring to the simplicity of some pop music. In this case, the chords are 1, 4, and 5. A perfect example is Hey Mickey by Tony Basil. Another common progression is 1, 6, 2, 5, as used in the oldie Summertime, Summertime by the Jamies.
It's summertime, 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 summertime.
Yet another common progression is a descending sequence based on a minor key.
Hit the road, Jack. Don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack. And don't you come back no more.
What you say?
Hit the road, Jack. And don't you come back.
This also works in the other direction, with chords going progressively higher, as in these 3 similar examples. Note how the last progression stayed in an F chord, but switched from F major to F minor. Changing the same chord from major to minor was used in the 1962 hit Sealed with a Kiss by Brian Hyland.
Though we gotta say goodbye for the summer, darling, I promise you this.
The opposite also works well, going from a minor chord to a major version of the same chord. This progression and similar variations are common, ranging from House of the Rising Sun by the Animals to For Your Love by the Yardbirds.
For your love. For your love. I'll give you everything and more, and that's for sure. For your love. I'll bring you diamond rings.
Earlier, I mentioned that melodies often build over time and strive for direction, and the same applies to chord progressions. One device repeatedly raises the fifth of the chord. In this case, the G note goes to G sharp, then to A, which is the sixth, then to the seventh B flat, finally resolving down to A, which is the third of the final F chord. This type of movement also works well in the opposite direction. Here, the root note on the top is repeatedly lowered, first to a major seventh, then to a minor seventh, then to a sixth, finally resolving to an F chord as before. There are many other chord progressions, and it's not practical to cover more than just a few here. Google can find chords for almost any song if you add sheet music after the song name when searching. But one progression is so incredibly common, overused, really, that it's worth mentioning. The 4-chord progression 1, 5, 6, 4 has been used on literally hundreds of pop tunes over the past 20 years. In fact, these chords, used in both Africa by Toto and Land Down Under by Men at Work, are derived from Pachelbel's Canon, a popular wedding staple. Apparently, some music really is timeless.
Gonna take a lot to drag me away from you. There's nothing that 100 men or more could ever do. I come from a land of love. Beat us slow and mention love. Can you hear the thunder?
For a very funny exposé of these chords, See the 4 Chords YouTube video by the pop duo Axis of Awesome, linked in the description for this video. There's also music that plays mostly one chord all the way through. 2 famous examples of this are Hoedown from the ballet Rodeo by Aaron Copland and Ravel's Bolero, which expounds on the same one-chord theme for more than 5 minutes. Two other musical terms you may have heard are consonance and dissonance. Generally speaking, consonance implies a stable chord that does not require resolution. It just sits there and sounds fine all by itself. A dissonant chord contains tension that isn't relieved until it's resolved by a consonant chord, as in these 3 examples. In each example, you heard a dissonant chord containing tension, followed by a consonant chord that resolves the tension. The last example contains even more tension than the first 2 because the C note in the bass doesn't go with a G chord. However, it still sounds acceptable because that C bass note relates and leads to the same C note that follows. Here they are again. Note that vertical time alignment is important for music that contains more than one staff line. If the top and bottom staves aren't aligned, the music is more difficult to read. This simple example has only half notes, but most music has different note lengths in the top and bottom staves. In this music, each beat in the lower staff aligns with notes that start at the same time in the upper staff. But back to dissonance, context is important. A dissonant 7th interval can become a beautiful major 7th chord simply by adding some notes. Same for a minor 2nd interval, which is even more dissonant. The dissonance sounds a little like the shower theme from the movie Psycho. The same dissonance you hear clearly in the first chord of each pair also exists in the second chord, but adding the other notes completely changes the tonality. The third example is similar, but the added notes create a D13th chord. Let's look at some common ways to add interest and color to basic chords. Most of the chords we've heard so far are basic triads containing only the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes of the scale. But other scale tones can be added to a chord to impart various colors. One common variation is the 6th chord, which adds the 6th note of the scale to the 1st, 3rd, and 5th. If a 7th is added, the chord is called a major 7th because it's the 7th note of a major scale. But most 7th chords use a flatted, or minor 7th, which adds dissonance that requires resolution. So unless a chord is specifically called out as a major 7th, a 7th chord is assumed to add the minor 7th note. Note that minor here refers only to the 7th note, not the chord itself. A 7th chord can be either a major or minor chord, depending on whether the 3rd is major or minor. The first example here is a normal C 7th chord, which is a major chord with a minor 7th added. The second example is a C minor 7th chord, which is a minor chord with a minor 7th added. Minor chords can also add a major 7th, as in the third example, though you can hear why this is less common. Other higher scale tones can be added to chords to make them more interesting or compelling. A C 9th chord adds both the 7th and 9th notes, which is the usual convention for jazz chords. A 7th chord adds a 7th note, a 9th chord adds the 7th and the 9th notes, an 11th chord adds the 7th, 9th, and 11th, and so forth. But color notes can be added individually or in smaller groups. For example, a common usage of the 13th chord includes only the 7th and 13th notes, omitting the 9th and 11th. We'll explore this very interesting chord in more detail shortly. There are also chords that add only a single color note, or shift one note higher or lower. The add 9 chord adds only the ninth, as opposed to a regular ninth chord that adds both the seventh and ninth notes. The added ninth in this example is the top B note, and it creates a dissonance that is resolved downward back to the top root note. The simple melody in the last bar was added just to show this musical device in a typical context. A related device alters one note in a chord up or down, again to add dissonance that's later resolved for calm and stability. This example is called a suspended fourth, or simply a sus4 chord, where the third is raised a half step to a fourth. If a fourth was instead added, the dissonance between the fourth and adjacent third would be unpleasant in most contexts. But the dissonant major second between the fourth and the fifth above, a whole step rather than a half step, creates a more pleasing tension that resolves when the fourth finally goes back down to a third. The dissonant major second between the suspended fourth and the fifth above can add a rich texture, as in this next vocal example from Mirage by Tommy James and the Shondells from 1967. Another suspension uses the 2-note rather than the 4, as made famous by country pianist Floyd Cramer. In this example from his 1960 hit Last Date, the sus2 is the D note in bars 2 and 4. Here are just those notes. Often a sus4 and sus2 are used together like this. Sus2 and sus4 chords are equally common with the guitar, both in major and minor keys. A sus2 chord is similar to the add 9 we saw earlier in that a 2-note is added. The difference isn't so much that an add 9 is an octave higher, though it often is, but rather that an add 9 includes the minor third, where a sus2 lowers the third to become a second. Note that all of these color notes and alterations can be applied equally to minor chords as well as major. For example, a minor sixth chord has a unique character that's very different from a major sixth. Two other common note alterations are called augmented and diminished. Both of these chord types refer to raising or lowering the fifth while leaving the other notes alone. In this first example at left, the fifth is raised a half step, which adds a sense of urgency, as you heard in the earlier example of a chord progression that repeatedly raises a note to add direction to a melody. Now you know that this chord is called augmented. The second example at right adds a seventh for additional tension. It's worth mentioning that augmented chords are related to the whole tone scale played earlier. A diminished chord was also used in the earlier example showing the 7 chords that derive naturally from the notes of a major scale. Unlike the augmented chord, which is major, a diminished chord starts with a minor chord, then lowers the fifth. That's why the E notes in these examples, the third note of the scale, have flats in front of them to create a C minor chord. The first example at left shows a plain C minor chord, then its diminished version, and the second example adds a sixth for increased tension. In truth, these A notes aren't really a sixth, and they're not even A notes. They're really a diminished seventh, which means they use a double flat to lower the pitch by a whole step rather than only a half step. So technically, this diminished seventh note is a B double flat. Note that a diminished chord can be a plain diminished triad with the fifth lowered by a half step, or it can include either a minor or diminished seventh. When a minor seventh is added, the chord is considered half diminished, or fully diminished when both the fifth and the seventh are lowered by a half step. Here's what these three chord types sound like, left to right. By the way, there's also a double sharp accidental that raises a note by a whole step rather than a half step. The symbol is similar to a lowercase letter X, as shown here. A related chord is called the flat 5, which is a major chord with a diminished fifth. This chord is common in jazz, both as the plain triad at left or with a seventh added as at right. Each type is shown in context, resolving to an F chord. Another alteration that you'll hear in almost every music score is what I call a sharp 4. As far as I know, this chord has no standard name, though it's incredibly common. It's similar to a flat 5 chord, but the context is different and so is the spelling. Where a flat 5 lowers the fifth scale note to a G flat, a sharp 4 raises the fourth note to an F sharp. Both of these altered notes, the sharp 4 and the flat 5, sound at the same pitch, but the mood they create is very different due to their context. I wrote an entire pop tune around this device called, appropriately enough, Sharp 4 using these notes. Some other examples of a sharp 4 are Pretty Ballerina by the Left Bank, Maria from West Side Story, and the Simpsons TV show theme by Danny Elfman.
A pretty ballerina, her hair so brilliant that it hurt my eyes.
Maria, I've just kissed a girl named Maria. Maria, Maria. No!
While you could think of a sharp 4 as a major chord with a diminished fifth, to my ears it's more like a major 2 chord played over a root bass note. In other words, the sharp 4 of the C major 1 chord becomes a major 3rd when the D major 2 chord is played. Having chords change while the underlying bass note stays the same is another common musical device we'll explore shortly. Another way to look at the sharp 4 chord in scale is belonging to the Lydian mode described earlier. But staying with the sharp 4, it was also used as a low note played by the basses to add an ominous sense of pending doom by both Andrew Lloyd Webber in Phantom of the Opera and Leonard Bernstein in the finale from West Side Story here. The 13th chord is one of the most powerful chords in modern music because it adds a very strong tension to a dominant chord. Even if you're not a musician, you've probably noticed this chord, which is heard in music ranging from opera to jazz to 1950s rock and roll. The 13th chord often marks the high point in a piece, though technically its correct name is 7 add 13 or 7 add 6. As mentioned earlier, the convention with jazz chords is to include all color notes up to and including the named note. So in theory, a 13th chord would include the 1st, 3rd, and 5th, plus the 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th. But that sound can be a little messy for some cultured ears. So as is typical for this chord, only the 7th and 13th notes are played. In this figure, the individual notes are identified, including the 7th and 13th. The B note is the third of the chord that establishes the chord as being major, but it's raised up an octave to avoid the congestion that can occur with closely spaced low notes. Here's how this chord sounds, followed by a typical resolution to C as shown. Some examples of the 13th chord are Habanera from the opera Carmen by Bizet, and Rolling River by my friend Tom Schultz, which you probably never heard. As I play each of these short examples, I'll flash 13th chord on the screen when it comes around, so you'll be sure not to miss its distinctive sound. This brings us to tonic and dominant chords, which are closely related to consonance and dissonance. A plain major or minor chord in its native key is considered tonic. A tonic chord conveys calm and sounds fine all by itself. There is no tension or need to resolve. On the other hand, a dominant chord contains dissonance, and its tension remains until a subsequent tonic chord resolves that tension. Plain major and minor triads are tonic, as are sixth chords and major seventh chords. Dominant chords almost always include a minor seventh, which in these examples is a B flat that resolves to an A in the subsequent F chord. Dominant chords can also include other color notes to increase the tension or just to add variety. One particularly strong dominant chord adds the seventh as usual, but also augments the fifth for added tension. As you can see, a plus symbol is shorthand for an augmented chord. Likewise, a minus sign indicates a diminished chord. One great example of an augmented seventh chord is in the oldie Let Me In by the Sensations. Many pop groups from the Beach Boys to the Beatles have used the augmented seventh chord. A ninth chord, with both the seventh and the ninth added, is also very strong, and the ninth can be either normal or flatted. In the last example, the flat 9 is in parentheses to indicate that the ninth is flat rather than the C chord itself. In other words, it's a C chord with a flatted ninth rather than a C flat chord with the seventh and ninth notes added. When there's no ambiguity, the parentheses are optional. As we've seen, a dominant chord leads strongly to its resolution, and this can be used to add emphasis to a standard 1-4 progression, to push it harder in that direction. Rather than simply go from C right to F, we first add a seventh to the C, which leads more strongly to the F that follows. By the way, in the key of C, the F chord is called subdominant and is a whole step below the dominant G chord. Earlier I mentioned the minor seventh chord briefly, so let's return to that again. In this case, minor refers to the chord itself as determined by its third, not whether the added seventh is major or minor. A minor seventh chord is also dominant because the seventh pushes toward a resolution. The first example shows a normal C seventh chord resolving to an F chord, followed by a C minor seventh chord resolving to an F. You can easily hear the difference in tonality between these two types of seventh chords. When using either type of seventh chord to propel a progression, even more interest can be added by taking a slight detour before adding the seventh. This example also goes from C to F, but inserts a G minor seventh chord between the C and the C seventh. Here, the G minor seventh chord is dominant in relation to the C seventh that follows, which in turn is dominant to the subsequent F. We can take this concept even further by inserting yet another dominant chord, a D seventh, between the C and G minor seventh. These detours add interest to the chord changes, yet they eventually arrive at the same F chord destination. Note that in all of these examples, a dominant chord pushes to another chord a fourth away. The D7th leads to G minor 7. The G minor 7th leads to C7, which then leads to the final F. The only chord change in this example that doesn't move by a fourth is the initial C to D7. But that progression sounds fine too. In fact, a 1-2 progression is very common, such as the song Tonight and several others from West Side Story. Again, the printed music is shown in the key of C because you already know these notes by their number and position, though Tonight is in the key of A flat. Either way, the chords go back and forth between a major 1 and a major 2. Here it is in the key of C. And this is the same 1-2 progression in A flat.
Tonight won't be just any night. Tonight there will...
The progression of a dominant 5 chord pushing to a tonic 1 chord is one of the most common movements in every style of music, from bluegrass to opera. In the key of C, the G chord, or 5 chord, commonly resolves back to the tonic root C chord. So in these detours, each destination chord is preceded by a chord that would be the 5 chord in its native key. Working backwards from right to left, C is the 5 chord for the key of F, G is the 5 chord for the key of C, and D is the 5 chord for the key of G. So this progression is mostly a cycle of 5-to-1 progressions, which brings us to the circle of fifths. The circle of fifths shown here is a tool to visualize the relation between all 12 musical keys. This is sometimes called the circle of fourths because the distance between a 5 chord and its 1 chord destination is an interval of a fourth. This chart progresses by fifths if you go around the circle clockwise, or fourths when considered counterclockwise. The capital letters in the outer circle indicate major keys, while lowercase is used for the minor keys in the inner circle. The major and minor chord names are offset such that A minor aligns with C major because both of these keys have no sharps or flats. The other related keys have the same number of sharps or flats. For example, D major and B minor both have 2 sharps. We'll look at relative major and minor keys shortly. The examples shown so far were written for the piano and show specific notes. Another type of music, called a lead sheet or chord chart, shows a shorthand version of a song. Lead sheets are common with popular music parts for guitar and piano. They show the melody and chord names and words for songs with lyrics, but no actual chord notes. This is much faster and easier for the composer because it leaves the specific notes and how they're played up to the musician. Here, only the piano introduction is written out. Most of the chord examples we've seen so far were simple triads having the root note at the bottom with the 3rd and 5th notes above in order, but that was done only for clarity. In practice, real music uses inversions, where any note in the chord can be the lowest note. A simple triad has 3 possible positions, shown here from left to right: the root position, first inversion, and second inversion. All 3 chords have the same C, E, and G notes. All that changes is which note is at the bottom. Inversions are used for 3 reasons. One is to make music sound more interesting. A chord takes on a different character depending on which is the lowest note. The second reason is to make changes from one chord to the next sound smoother by avoiding large jumps between successive notes. This also reduces the amount of hand movement required by the musicians. The last reason to use inversions is to add direction to the music by creating a moving bass line. We'll address bass lines in a moment. Using plain triad chords in the root position is fine for a simple tune like Louie Louie, but nobody will confuse this old garage band anthem with sophisticated music. Notice the repeat sign, the double vertical lines and dots at the end of the second bar that direct the musician back to the previous reversed sign, or to the beginning of the piece if no preceding sign is shown. In this case, the same 2 bars are repeated for the entire duration of the song. This example uses the same chords and notes, but the top notes in the F and G minor chords are moved an octave lower to be at the bottom. This keeps all three chords more or less in the same place on the keyboard. For a song like Louie Louie, where the chords keep changing, it's common for the bass to play only the root note of each chord. But with most pop tunes, a single chord will extend for longer than half a bar, and the bass needs to do more than just play the root note if it's to remain interesting. One common bass line alternates between the root and fifth notes, as in Una Paloma Blanca by the George Baker Selection from 1976.
When the sun shines on the mountains and the night is on the run, it's a new day.
Since the third isn't played, this simple bass line works in both major and minor keys. Another fairly simple device is called the walking bass line, where the bass plays mostly scale and arpeggio notes. This is more interesting than just bouncing between the root and fifth notes, especially when a single chord extends for several bars in a row, as in this version of Just a Gigolo by David Lee Roth, though you'll also hear several 5-to-1 moves too, as noted in this music.
I'm just a gigolo, and everywhere I go, people know the part I'm playing. Pay for every dance, selling each romance. Ooh, what to say? There will come a day when youth will pass away. What will they say about me when the end comes? I know.
Even sophisticated jazz bass players fall back on simple 1-5 bass lines where appropriate, as performed here by Stanley Clarke on the tune Spain by Chick Corea in his band Return to Forever. Just as music takes on a different character when the first, third, or fifth scale note is used for the melody, the note used for the bass also changes the mood. These chord examples shown earlier repeat the root note of each chord an octave lower in the bass staff because that's a common way to write such a part for the piano. But bass lines can be improved greatly by using other notes from the chord. This not only adds variety and interest, it can also provide direction for the bass line. This next example is adopted from a song written by my friend Rob Carlson. The first time through, the bass plays the root note of each chord, but the second time the bass goes up to an E note, the third of the chord. I think you'll agree the sound is much richer with these bass inversions. Here's just the first two bars each way again. Note the rising bass line in the second version that passes from C through D on the way to E. Here, the D note is the fifth of the G7th chord. This propels the bass line and gives it direction rather than just jumping from C to E. As you can see, the convention for specifying bass notes other than the root uses the chord name followed by a slash, then the bass note. This is pronounced G7 over D and C sus4 over G. Another useful inversion puts the third in the bass of a minor chord, as you can hear in this adaptation of Deck the Halls. This example also puts the fifth G note in the bass for the next two C chords. To make the comparison even clearer, here are just the chords D minor, C, G, C, using the root for each bass note, then again using the third and fifth. To my ears, the second version is much more interesting and musical. Bass notes aren't limited to just the first, third, and fifth scale tones. Any color notes present in a chord can be used, as in this example that puts the seventh in the bass. Just like melody lines that need to resolve up or down depending on context, this bass note resolves downward to the third of the subsequent B-flat chord. This is called voice leading, and we'll cover that in more detail in a moment. No discussion of bass lines would be complete without mentioning James Jamerson, the virtuoso bass player who performed on countless Motown hits in the 1960s and 70s. James elevated bass lines into new territory by playing fast 16th note runs in a way that doesn't interfere with the melody, yet his exquisitely chosen notes add great interest and momentum. To my ears, many of those hit tunes are like a bass duet with the singer, and Stevie Wonder's I Was Made to Love Her is a great example.
Disapproved it, my mama booed it, but I told them time and time again, don't you know I was made to love.
The book, Standing in the Shadows of Motown, linked in the description for this video, includes printed transcriptions of many of Jamerson's most famous bass lines, plus an audio CD with cover versions played by well-known bass players. It's not unreasonable to say that all modern pop, soul, funk, and jazz bass players owe a huge debt to James Jamerson.